quickly introduce myself. My name is Kiran Kuppa. I'm a migrations SA with AWS. I've been with Amazon for about 6 years now, and I'm based out of Dallas, as Ron was mentioning. So many times we talk to our customers about migration and modernization. There are usually many questions that usually customers ask. These questions range anywhere from, hey, what is the right approach versus what is the right solution? So in this session, what we're going to try and highlight is that at least take a very high look. Again, 20 minutes or 30 minutes is really hard to cover a lot of ground on the migration strategy and modernization strategy, but we will try to cover a few tools, and we'll also try and understand what different methodologies that we can employ as well. So for the next 30 minutes, we will be talking about some of the migration and modernization methodologies, and we will also talk about some of the migration and modernization tools that AWS has to offer in this space. Moving along. So again, when it comes to migrations, right, the first and foremost question most customers ask is, how do I start and where do I start? What are the tools that are required and what is the methodology should I use? So this essentially is something called as a migration acceleration methodology that we've adopted. You might have seen this slide in the past as well, and maybe in a different variant, but the idea essentially here is we've identified many different processes based on many customer experiences, working both small scale and large scale migrations. And we've come up with a very specific pattern that usually suits most of the customers. And this is the standard framework that we adopted when it comes to migration and modernization. Which essentially consists of three different phases. The first phase is assessment phase. Then we have something called a mobilize phase. And then we have something called migrate modernize phase. So when we talk about migrations or modernization, it is very easy to start jumping into the AWS account and start playing with certain services and then start moving your applications. But it really works for one or two applications at a small scale. But when you look at a really large scale migration or modernization effort, let's say, for example, you are moving a suite of 10 applications or 20 applications or hundreds of applications, or maybe an entire data center. What are some of the things that you need to do as a step-by-step process so that you can especially improve your migration velocity and also make minimal number of mistakes during the process? So in the SS phase, what we try to do is there are a bunch of activities that we can talk about. But again, the idea here is to essentially create a change, create a case for a change, or develop a business case for migrations. Now, depending on the organization, depending on what your maturity level in the cloud is, these activities can be maybe ripped and replaced. Maybe there is some other activity that we can bring to the table as well. But some of the important stuff that we really need to do in this particular phase is do a rapid discovery of your infrastructure. So the idea is, even before we start migrating, we need to understand what's inside your data center, what applications, how many servers are there, what are the application dependencies, very importantly, right? So let's say if you have 100 applications, and if you want to move one application, you want to make sure you're not bringing other applications in the process. You want to understand, hey, is this application using a dedicated database or a shared database? Is this application making another API call to a different application which we never knew about, and things like that? So when it comes to large customers and large scale migrations, these are like some of the important questions that we need to answer in that first phase. Apart from rapid discovery, the other important activity that we usually perform in this phase is migration readiness assessment, where we essentially take a look at your existing maturity level in the cloud, and we help you with identifying multiple facets of migration. And we will talk about migration acceleration or migration readiness assessment in a minute. In the mobilize phase is where we essentially, again, there are a bunch of activities, out of which a couple of things are very important in this phase, whereas the first one is essentially building a landing zone. So landing zone is something that we refer to as the base configuration of AWS architecture that you have to set up in place before you start moving the applications. So if you think of it this way, where if you're moving to a new data center, the first thing that you need to make sure is you need to have your networking in place, you need to have your authentication mechanisms, the security policies, you need to have your let's say application deployment methodologies, the tooling that goes into it, and all these aspects. And only then your actual application installation starts on top of it. So very similar to that, when it goes to AWS, we essentially have to build a landing zone so that everything that is coming as a part of migration can be accommodated on the AWS platform. And the second important piece in this mobilize phase is essentially something called a migration plan. So migration plan, what we do here is typically we identify your hundreds or thousands or applications or maybe an entire data center We take that and we essentially create a plan for migration on how and what applications should be migrating first versus what comes second and what comes last. So this is essentially a migration plan. We essentially work with the customers to identify what these applications are, take the dependency mapping that we've got in the assessment phase and create a migration plan. And once we have this, we essentially address the operating model, the security and compliance model, and all the skill set that is required for somebody to operate successfully on the cloud. And this is where once we have these pieces in place, then we start to begin the process of migration modernization. Again, from migration and modernization, the term is usually used synonymously sometimes, but again, there's a lot of difference in the technology tools that we use. When we are talking about migration, we are mostly referring to something more as a lift and shift, but modernization is essentially taking your existing application and changing it completely into something different so that your applications are more cloud native. But again, even with a lot of lift and shift when you're migrating, there are certain services inside the cloud that will still qualify as modernization because you will not be using the same networking constructs, you will not be using the same load balancers or same methodology of distributing applications. So there is a lot of modernization in the migration phase as well when it comes to lift and shifting of applications. So let's take a look at some of the activities in a little more depth. So as I mentioned earlier, migration readiness assessment is essentially an activity that we perform during the assessment phase. This is very important, even if you are a mature customer on the AWS platform, we still prefer to run this assessment because what we do is we essentially take this approach of a cloud adoption framework. Where cloud adoption framework essentially talks about in two levels. One is the business capabilities focus and has a technical capability focus. And within those two focus areas, we have things like business, people, governance model, platform, security, and operations. And these are the things that we essentially cover. Now, this workshop is usually about anywhere between 2 to 6 hours, depending on the complexity and the depth that you want to hit. But the idea is there are a set of about 70 questions that we run with the customer. And once we run these questions, we essentially identify what the gaps are. And we essentially identify what the next steps should be to plug those gaps in. And if you see on this right-hand side is essentially where we provide an output in case of different graphs, where we essentially provide you with the details of where you lie in terms of security versus operations versus governance and so on and so forth. So very important activity has to be done before migrations. Now, let me introduce you to the new 7R methodology. So this methodology is built on Gartner's 5R methodology that was published in like 2011, I believe. So the idea is we essentially have, let's say you are looking to migrate multiple applications into the cloud. We need to make a determination of what this application is going to be when it moves into the cloud. Right. So from the 7R methodology, we essentially take a look at them as relocate, rehosting, replatforming, repurchasing, refactor, retain, or retire. So these are the 7 R's for an application migration. Now, in this, the input of the information that we got as an application dependency mapping is something very critical. So what we got in our assessment phase is the dependency mapping, and based on the dependency mapping, we're going to decide and put our applications into one of these buckets so that this will decide what that application migration is going to look like. Now, there might be some applications which might be a simple lift and shift, which is essentially either a relocate or a rehost, and some applications might need a lot of replatforming and refactoring, which would fall under those other paths. Now, one important thing you remember here is the lower cost to run if you're going to relocate and rehost. It's much faster and to migrate, and it's going to cost you much lower. But when you move down the chart here, when you look at replatforming and refactoring, it essentially takes a much longer time to migrate, but essentially the value, there's a higher longer term value. So essentially you need to find a balance between what you want to do with your applications. Now, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do here is we essentially are identifying what bucket your application will fall in when it essentially moves to AWS platform. Now, with that being said, once we identified our applications, what are we going to do next with those applications? So the idea here is we need to identify the tools that we will be using for this specific application. So in this sense here, we have these 7 R's as on the top, as you see, relocate, rehost, replatform, and these are the 7 R's. And based on the path that we want to take, we're going to pick and choose a tool. So for relocate and rehost, mostly seen as lift and shift. There are services like VMC on AWS or Outposts or containers or Cloud Endure, server migration service, database migration service. Sorry, I'm throwing a lot of service names here, but again, these are some of the native tooling that AWS will provide you to essentially make that move very quickly. And we will cover some of these services as well in a bit. But for the other ones, when we talk about replatforming, refactoring, I know we talked about low code in the previous session. So these are some of the things that when you go to cloud, you essentially want to try and make something more cloud native. Is essentially we need to work with you very closely to understand what it means to you. So in the sense, if you are taking, let's say, a monolith application, you want to break that into a microservices model. If you're taking an application, you don't have a CI/CD pipeline, you want to build a CI/CD pipeline when you go into the cloud. So what would that look like? So essentially, these are deeper dive workshops that we do with our customers, and we spend about anywhere between 2 to 5 hours for each application, depending on the complexity. And the idea of that workshop is going to be end of that session. We typically give you the future state architecture of what it will look inside the cloud. So that's essentially the plan here. Now, for the other ones that are retire and retain, there are probably many applications that are probably not worth migrating. Maybe it does not make any business sense, or maybe it makes sense to just shut them off, right? So in that scenarios, those are retire and retain. Those are some decisions that you have to make internally within your teams. Now, the end of this exercise essentially gives you that 7-hour disposition for the applications so that you can essentially plan your migrations for the next stage. So in here, again, some of the deep dive workshop methodologies that we do, some of the approaches that we take is essentially a questionnaire-based model. We can provide you with a bunch of questions. You can essentially help answer those questions in terms of how the application is. Again, it could be, the questionnaire could be divided into subsections where we can talk about networking aspect of it, security aspect of it, authentication, authorization aspect of it, and go and so on and so forth. Again, most of these are usually multi-day workshops and whiteboarding sessions where we're working very closely with customer to understand and essentially give them the future state architecture. Again, if you don't need AWS help at that point, then essentially there is also self-service prescriptive guidance tools that are available. So in the sense, let's say, for example, if I want to migrate my mainframes, what does the migration pattern look like? If I want to migrate my WebSphere applications, what are the steps to take? So these prescriptive guidance is available for different architectural patterns, and you can simply take a look at those and see and make a determination. And again, AWS is always here to help out on whichever path that you take. So once you have the creation of migration waves, right, it's also important to plan this in terms of migration planning. So in terms of migration modernization planning, there are services that AWS can provide, which are things like AWS Migration Hub Service, Cloud Endure Migration Factory. If you're using AWS professional services teams, we have something called as a portfolio analysis assessment, where we will talk about how to migrate and what are the waves and the details of the migration and so on and so forth. And there are many other partner products and solutions in the space as well. So definitely we have a plethora of options when it comes to creating those migration waves and planning your migrations. So once that we have our landing zone that is ready, the infrastructure that we need for applications to migrate, and also that we have the migration plan ready, we know which applications are going to go first and which will go next, then this is where we start migrating your applications. Now, if you are following an agile methodology, you can always use an agile process like sprints and waves and stories if that suits you better. But the idea here is to always start with 1 or maybe 2 to 5 applications at the beginning. So take these 2 to 5 applications and start them and run them through the migration pipeline, which is essentially creating a POC, dev test, load testing, run a well-architected review, and do a production cutover. Once we do these 2 to 5 applications, you essentially develop that muscle memory to essentially see what is the best suited process for your company and for your teams in the way that you're organized. And once you identify and once you streamline that process, you can simply rinse and repeat that for the rest of the applications as well. So once you identify what the process is, essentially the first couple of months is going to be difficult understanding the process, but after that, everything will be pretty straightforward in terms of pipeline, and you can automate the pipeline as well as much as possible. So now let's take a look at some of the services that essentially come in play. So in this migration journey, right? As I mentioned earlier, discovering your applications is extremely important, understanding what application dependencies are. So again, this service, AWS service, which is called ADS, which will help you identify application inventory, will help you map application dependencies, and it will also help you baseline system and process performance, right? So what that means is, let's say, for example, if you're using 100 virtual machines on-prem, now when you go into the cloud, you probably might not need all 100 machines. You might be able to maybe reduce the count to maybe 50 machines based on the CPU and memory utilization. So this ADS service essentially will capture all the information and will be able to provide you with the recommendations on how or what should be running on AWS side. Now, how does this work? It essentially is, we can deploy it as an agent-based system, or you can deploy an appliance in your VMware environment, which will essentially be an agentless system. So with agent-based discovery, the idea is you will be installing this ADS agent on the on-prem virtual machines, and this agent is going to essentially identify the details of dependency mapping. We'll take a look at the network traces of the machine, and we essentially say, hey, this machine is talking to this database. Now, after running this exercise, you will identify how many machines or how many applications are using a dedicated database with a shared database, right? How many applications are making an API call to another subsystem that we never even knew that was happening in the background. So all the details are essentially revealed in this process. Now, ADS is one of the services. There are other partner solutions as well that essentially play in the space. If you're looking for much more detailed analysis of some of the other things, we can always work with you identifying the right tool to essentially see which tool suits the best for you. And once we have this information, we will take that information and bring it into the cloud so that we help you with the migration planning and so on and so forth. The next service I want to quickly talk about is the lift and shift. So when we talked about lift and shift, is again, it's a fairly important R or a methodology in terms of migrations. So when people think about migrations, they always think about, hey, let's move into the cloud and let's do the latest and greatest serverless functions and stuff like that, right? So you always want to go into the cloud with the best intentions to leverage the best possible service and make it as cloud native as possible. But again, based on my experience, what we've seen is large-scale companies, when they take this approach, usually it will lead to a lot of analysis paralysis. You always want to try and nail down the architecture, and essentially it takes a very, very long time to even launch the first product on the cloud. So I would say our recommendation would be to essentially see whatever you can lift and shift first, right? So that you can simply get used to the cloud, get used to the services, get used to the environment. And once you have that, once you develop that expertise on handling AWS cloud, you can leverage the native AWS services. So lift and shift, again, is a very important component of migration and modernization part. So let's take a look at that really quick. So in this place, we recently rebranded the service called Application Migration Service, or MGN. This actually was previously called as the Cloud Endure service. So with MGN or Cloud Endure, we can use that synonymously at this point because it just got rebranded, and not many people are used to using MGN versus Cloud Endure. But again, essentially they're talking about the same service. So again, this service will give you a very flexible way, very automated way, and very reliable way of moving virtual machines into the cloud, and essentially keeps the disruption to the business very, very low and makes the cutovers very, very, very seamless. The biggest thing about the service is essentially the low RPOs and RPOs that it will give you. Essentially talk about the least amount of impact for the applications and the best cutover times. And there is no additional cost to migrate using the service on the AWS platform. So let's take a look at how this works. So MGN service is essentially agent-based service. So on the left-hand side, you're looking at your corporate data center where you have multiple machines where you'll be installing the replication agent. On the right-hand side is the MGN service on the cloud platform, and this is where we essentially have something called a staging area, where we have something called as replication servers, which are responsible for using that agent and replicating the blocks of data into EBS volumes on the AWS side. So at this point, what we're doing is we are only paying for the EBS volumes and not for the virtual machines, which essentially is a huge value proposition in terms of finance. Once we are ready to cut over or migrate, you simply use the automation that's built in, and you can simply click on launch a new machine. It essentially puts the new machine with attached volume that has been replicated at a block level into your target region, and it is a seamless migration. Now, if you've been in migrations or if you've been working in data centers for a very long time, I can assure you that this is the easiest way, or as easy as it gets, when it comes to migrating a machine from like on-prem to AWS cloud, because it literally takes about like 5 minutes to set it up, and it starts migrating immediately. So a really effective tool in terms of lift and shift. Now, that is what we talked about. MGN was for single machine, right? So again, there is a lot of automation built in. But when we talk about, like, let's say thousands of machines, then a little bit of additional automation is always helpful. So this is where something called the Migration Factory comes in play. So Migration Factory essentially is an integrated orchestration platform. Again, it has multiple custom-written automation scripts and runbooks, and this integrates with Cloud Endure or MGN and gives it additional capabilities for migrating at large scale. So rule of thumb is, if you're looking at migrating about like maybe 10 or 20 servers, use Cloud Endure or MGN as a native service. But if you're looking at hundreds of servers on hundreds of applications, then having some kind of a automated mechanism like Migration Factory is going to really help. So in here, the way this works is we don't look at machine level anymore. We are looking at wave or per wave modes. For example, if you have like 100 applications, and each application could have like 10 or 20 servers behind them. So when you're migrating, you're not looking at them as an app server by server, but you're looking at it as an application wave itself, where all 20 machines will be migrating at one single shot. So again, it gives you a lot of visibility into how the replication happens, how to do a dry run with a cutover, how to launch instance, how to customize after launch, and so on and so forth. And all of that automation is built into it. Makes it pretty seamless to move into the cloud. Now, when it comes to the platform or choices, we usually talk about modernization, right? When we talk about modernization, there are many different paths customers can take. So again, from the platform choices, you can run your application simply on EC2 instances of lift and shift. But if you want to take a look at the higher level services, there is additional automation built in with services like Elastic Beanstalk. Elastic Beanstalk essentially is a orchestration layer on how your applications are being deployed inside your, maybe you can leverage CI/CD pipelines and maybe you automate some of that stuff. And all of that can be handled by Elastic Beanstalk. If you're looking to containerize your existing applications, moving into the cloud, then there are services like ACS, Fargate, and EKS. And we've been talking about Kubernetes and other services throughout the day here. And those essentially are other platform choices when it comes to running your workloads on AWS. And again, when if you want to go to something more serverless, then there are serverless with Lambda functions where you can essentially run your workload as code instead of running them on servers. And again, there's a different compatibility things that we need to take care of. And this is where AWS can actually help you take a look at your application to decide what is the best path and the least and the path of least resistance when it comes to modernization. So the different options are available. When it comes to databases, very similarly, you have self-managed databases, you have commercial databases, and you have open source databases. Again, talking about modernization, there is a huge push with many of my customers right now to move away from the proprietary databases to something more open source. So if you're looking for moving to an open source database, there are many services that can help you in the space as well, especially with database migration services that can help you move and migrate your databases in a homogeneous way, for example, from SQL to SQL, Oracle to Oracle, or if you want to go from maybe SQL to PostgreSQL, or maybe if you want to go to from Oracle database to Aurora Postgres. So database migration services tool is going to help you with that migration and modernization effort. Now, when it comes to applications, again, Windows 2003 has been end of life for a very long time now, so it's like 2008. So if you have multiple applications that are running on 2003 and 2008 machines, what is the path forward, right? So we have a service, we have a program, actually not a service, program called EMP, which will essentially help you take a look at your legacy application, package that application into a container-based approach, or maybe we'll move that into an application server, and package that machine so that you can run that application seamlessly on AWS EC2 instances. So if you have installation media, then great, we can take a leverage or take that and move it. And if you don't have installation media, which I'm sure many customers have that as well, where we can do reverse engineering or do reverse packaging of that application and all the dependencies and create a package out of it, which can essentially run on the latest version of the Windows operating system. So that's another offering in terms of end of support applications. App Container is another service which will help you essentially transform your applications running on virtual machines and move them into containers for ECS or EKS. Now, how does this really work? Let's take a quick look. It essentially helps out with very specific scenarios where if your application is an ASP.NET based application that is running on IIS, or any Java based application that is running on Spring Boot, Tomcat, JBoss, WebSphere, or WebLogic, right? So the deployment source could be anywhere. It could be a VM, it could be on-prem, it could be running on EC2, or maybe even other cloud providers. We can take that application, we can run it through A2C, which is app to container source. And what we do is we essentially build a Docker container out of that. So we essentially package the application, build a Docker container, and we can save the Docker container into AWS services or somewhere else if you wish to. And then what we do is we convert that application into like task definitions that are needed for running that particular application, either on ECS or EKS. And you can also store those images on ECR, which is the native container registry on AWS platform. So that's for app to container. Again, this is essentially a CLI-based tool. Again, it supports ASP.NET applications, and from the Windows point of view, and for Linux, it is essentially Java-based apps. And these are some very specific scenarios. Last but not the least, mainframe migrations. Again, this is usually a huge topic with many of our customers, where they've been running mainframes for a very, very long time. And some of the biggest challenges are they essentially cost you like 4 times higher, and there is no talent pool out there who can essentially support it on an ongoing basis. Mainframes, what we see with customers are they're telling us that they're really rigid. Essentially, they stifle the digitalization and the development of any organization or products and services that they offer. And usually, because of the way that it is logged in, your data gets logged up, and you cannot leverage that data with other systems that will give you that competitive advantage of driving differentiators for like things like data and analytics workloads and so on and so forth. So how do we solve for this? Again, this is an overview of what your options are. That again, if you look at like really short term, you essentially want to simply augment based on the data and analytics services on the AWS platform. For the short term migration, you're looking at somewhere between 6 months to 2 years. It's going to cost you a little more. And for long-term migrations, you're looking to redevelop and rewrite the applications, which would be a multi-year engagement. But again, eventually, you will be moving into the cloud in a more native way. So from the options and impact, these are different options, what we're looking at. This is essentially a high-level diagram of what your mainframe platform is. And when you move that into the different solutions, what are the things that you keep consistent and what are the things that you move? Like blue is the one that are going to be the same, and essentially yellow is the one that you're changing here in this case. So if you're using legacy hardware emulation, you're essentially changing the underlying platform. If you're using legacy middleware emulation, they're using the middleware transformation as well. And again, for automated refactoring, you're essentially pretty much changing everything except your business functions, and also modernization of middleware and replatforming, you're actually changing the components that are running it. So this is like at a very high level, some of the changes. From the mainframe options, right, from the migration and impact, again, we also work very closely with many partners in this space, and each partner has their specialization in terms of how the migration happens and how they essentially support us. So with that, with that, I'm gonna stop here. I know that we're on time as well. I know this is these are really deeper and larger topics, and it's really difficult to cover in 30 minutes. But again, if you have any questions around migration and modernization,